The air in Lake Placid was not just cold on that afternoon in February, it was a physical weight that pressed against the lungs of every man on that mountain. Danny Filippidis was a firefighter, a man built from the grit and tempered steel of Toronto, someone who understood the lethal nature of the elements better than most. It was the middle of the day, around 2:30 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, when the fabric of reality decided to fold in on itself, without warning. Danny told his friends he was heading back to the car to grab his phone, a simple walk through the crunching, crystalline powder of the parking lot at the Whiteface Mountain ski resort. That was the last moment of a recognizable life for Danny, as the sky turned a bruised shade of gray that seemed to swallow the sun and leave only a hollow, vibrating silence in its wake. When Danny did not return within 20 minutes, the initial annoyance of his companions curdled into something much darker and more visceral. They searched the vehicle first, finding the doors locked and the interior empty of any sign of struggle or even the lingering warmth of a human presence. The mountain was a jagged spine of granite and ice that seemed to watch them with a cold, unblinking indifference that made the hair on their necks stand up. Bloodhounds were brought in by the local authorities, their noses pressing deep into the freezing slush, but they found nothing but the dead end of a trail that simply stopped in the middle of a clearing. It was as if he had stepped off the face of the earth, leaving not a single boot print in the fresh drift or a broken branch to mark his passing. The state police combed the woods for 6 days, their flashlights cutting weak yellow arcs through the encroaching, suffocating shadows of the Adirondacks. They used thermal imaging and helicopters that beat the air into a frenzy, searching for a heat signature that never appeared on their cold green screens. The temperature at night dropped to 5 degrees below zero, a level of cold that turns human skin into a map of frostbite and stops the heart within hours. Every expert on the scene agreed that no one survives 6 nights in those conditions without shelter, fire, or specialized gear. Yet the mountain remained silent, refusing to yield a body or a scrap of clothing to the hundreds of searchers who risked their own lives in the whiteout conditions. 6 days of silence followed a period of time that felt like a slow drowning for the family waiting for news in Ontario. Then the phone rang in a quiet suburb thousands of miles away, shattering the stillness of a Tuesday morning. It was Danny calling from a roadside in Sacramento, California, a location that defied every law of logic and distance known to man. He sounded like a man speaking from the bottom of a very deep, very dark well, his voice thin and laced with a confusion that bordered on physical pain. He did not know how he had crossed nearly 3,000 miles of North American soil in less than 144 hours. When investigators finally sat across from him in a sterile California hospital room, they saw a man who had been through a meat grinder of the soul. His face was weathered by more than just the sun of the West Coast it bore, the hollowed-out look of someone who had looked directly into a void and found it looking back. He remembered fragments of a truck, a large vehicle with a dark, cavernous interior, and a sense of motion that felt wrong. Like the world was sliding past him too fast to be real. He was found wearing a brand new set of clothes he did not recognize, and his head was filled with a thick gray fog that refused to lift. The medical exams showed no signs of trauma to the skull, no drugs in his system, and no evidence of a prolonged mental breakdown or a psychotic break. One of the most unsettling details was his physical appearance, which suggested a level of care that contradicted the theory of a confused wanderer. His hair had been neatly trimmed, a clinical grooming that suggested he had been handled by something with a very specific, almost surgical intent. His boots were scuffed, but not ruined, and his hands were not the frostbitten claws of a man who had been sleeping in the snow for a week. He possessed a brand new iPhone, a device he had never purchased, which added another layer of impossibility to an already fractured narrative. It was as if he had been taken out of the world, processed by an intelligence we cannot comprehend, and then dropped back into a random location like a piece of discarded luggage. The Adirondack Mountains are formed from some of the most ancient rock on the planet, and they hold secrets that they do not give up to the prying eyes of modern science. There are places in those woods where the air feels unnaturally thick, where the birds go silent for no reason, and where the sense of being an intruder becomes overwhelming. We see this pattern again and again in the high country, where the geography of the unknown overlaps with our national parks. A person walks 10 feet away from their group and is swallowed by a silence that no shout can penetrate. When they return, if they are lucky enough to return at all, they are altered, changed by an experience that has no name in our vocabulary. Think about the sheer impossibility of that transit across the continent without a wallet, a vehicle, or a memory. 3,000 miles is a distance that requires planning currency and a trail of digital breadcrumbs that we all leave behind in the 21st century. Danny had none of these things, yet he moved through the world like a ghost in the machine, invisible to the thousands of cameras that line our highways. He spoke of a feeling of being watched, of a presence that hovered just out of his line of sight during his long, dark journey to the coast. This is not the behavior of a man who suffered a simple fugue state, as a fugue state does not buy you a new wardrobe and a haircut while you are wandering through a blacked-out consciousness. The case of Danny Filippidis remains a jagged shard in the files of the Unexplained, a reminder that our understanding of reality is a thin veil. He survived the ordeal, but the man who came back to Toronto was not entirely the same man who went up the mountain in Lake Placid. He lives now with a hole in his life, a week of existence that has been erased by a hand that leaves no fingerprints and no clues. It is a chilling reminder that the wild places are not ours, and that sometimes the mountain takes more than just your breath. It takes your very identity. We are left to wonder about the nature of the transport and the entities that might operate in the spaces between the trees. This case matches the terrifying disappearance of Stephen Kubacki in 1978, a man who vanished while cross-country skiing near Lake Michigan. Kubacki left only his skis and poles behind in the snow, creating a mystery that baffled investigators for over a year. He woke up 15 months later in a field in Massachusetts, wearing clothes that were not his and possessing no memory of the intervening months of his life. Both men were found hundreds of miles from their points of disappearance, separated by vast distances and a complete lack of logical explanation for their travel. The pattern suggests a predator, or perhaps a phenomenon that operates outside of time and space as we understand it, watching us from the shadows of the pines. Waiting for the next person to step. Just a few feet off the path, the weight of the mountain is a physical thing. It presses down on your skull until you forget your own name. We talk about these cases as if they are isolated incidents, but they are stitches in a larger, uglier garment. When you look at the map of these disappearances, you do not see a random scatter of dots. You see a sequence. You see a design that defies our understanding of biology and physics. The silence that follows a disappearance is not just the absence of sound. It is a predator in its own right. It consumes the cries of the lost and the whistles of the searchers, until there is nothing left but the wind. The previous accounts of Danny Filippidis and Stephen Kubacki provide a terrifying baseline for what we are dealing with. A man vanishes in New York and wakes up in California with a fresh haircut and a new wardrobe, possessing no memory of the 3,000 miles he crossed. Another leaves his skis in the snow of Michigan and reappears 15 months later in a field in Massachusetts, wearing clothes that do not belong to him. These are not mere accidents or instances of simple amnesia. They are evidence of a transport mechanism that operates outside our laws of travel. This is the reality of the high country, where the geography of the unknown overlaps with our national parks. Consider the case of the mountain itself. Not as a pile of rock and dirt, but as a living, breathing entity with its own hungers. In the late autumn of 1994, a man named Thomas entered the dense brush of the Olympic Peninsula. He was an experienced tracker, a man who could read the language of the broken twig and the disturbed moss. He was not a man to get lost in a patch of woods he had hunted for 20 years. Yet within 30 minutes of leaving his truck, the world tilted on its axis. And Thomas became a ghost in a landscape he thought he knew. The air in those woods has a peculiar quality, a density that feels like breathing through wet wool. Thomas later reported that the birds went quiet all at once, as if a conductor had lowered a baton. The wind, which had been a constant companion, died to an absolute unnatural zero. It is the moment the door between our world and something else begins to creak open. He felt a vibration in his teeth, a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the very roots of the ancient firs. It was the sound of a trap being sprung, a sound that no electronic device has ever successfully captured. Search and rescue teams arrived within 12 hours, bringing with them bloodhounds trained to find a needle in a haystack of scent. They found nothing. The dogs, usually eager to please, refused to enter a specific grove of hemlock trees. They whined, their tails tucked between their legs, and backed away from an invisible barrier. It was as if the scent of the man had been cauterized from the earth, as if he had simply been plucked from the timeline by a giant hand. The thermal imaging cameras on the helicopters saw only the cold, unyielding green of the canopy. 5 days later, the mountain decided to give him back. Thomas was found sitting on a boulder 4 miles away from his last known position, in an area that had been cleared by ground teams 3 times. He was missing his boots and his orange safety vest, yet his socks were clean and dry. In the high country, this is an impossibility. The ground was a quagmire of mud and melting snow, yet the white cotton of his socks was as pristine as the day they left the package. He was staring into the middle distance, his eyes wide and tracking something that only he could see. Something that hovered in the air just above the tree line. When they finally got him to the hospital, the doctors found no signs of exposure. No frostbite, no dehydration, no starvation. For 5 days, Thomas had existed in a state of suspended animation. He could not tell them where he had been or how he had traveled across the rugged terrain without footwear. He only spoke of the bright lights that looked like stars falling through the trees. He spoke of the tall figures that moved with a disjointed mechanical grace. Figures that had no faces. Only smooth, pale surfaces where features should have been. This is the recurring nightmare of the missing 411 files. The victims are often returned with their clothing missing or altered, as if they were specimens being examined by a cold clinical intelligence. We see this with children who vanish in a blink and are found miles away up sheer cliffs that an adult could not climb without gear. We see it with the elderly who wander into the brush and are never heard from again. There is a specific cruelty to this phenomenon, a disregard for the boundaries of our physical reality. The mountain does not just take it experiments. It probes the limits of our endurance and our sanity. Let us talk about the granite. In almost every one of these clusters, we find ourselves standing on massive formations of igneous rock. Scientists tell us that granite has a high quartz content, a mineral known for its piezoelectric properties. Is it possible that under the right atmospheric conditions, these mountain ranges act as massive conductors? Are they generating a field that thins the fabric of our dimension? It sounds like science fiction until you are the one standing in the silent woods feeling the hair on your arms stand up. As the air begins to shimmer like heat rising from a summer road, I have spent years looking at these maps, tracing the lines of disappearances with a weary finger. The patterns are undeniable. They follow the water, they follow the rock, and they follow the silence. We are dealing with something that understands our geography better than we do. It knows the blind spots of our satellites and the limits of our search techniques. It waits in the shadows of the boulders, patient and ancient. It is a presence that has been here long before we carved our trails and built our visitor centers. And it will be here long after the forest has reclaimed our bones. The fear is not just in the vanishing, but in the return. The people who come back are often haunted by a sense of displacement. They feel like intruders in their own lives, as if a part of them was left behind in that other place. They look at their families with the eyes of a stranger searching for a familiarity that has been stripped away. Thomas never went back to the woods. He spent the rest of his life in a small apartment with the curtains drawn, jumping at every strange sound from the hallway. He knew that once the mountain has your scent, it never truly lets go. There is a darkness that lives in the heart of the wilderness, a darkness that our ancestors understood and respected. We have forgotten that respect. We enter the wild with our digital maps and our cell phones thinking we are masters of our environment. But when the batteries die and the signal fades, we are just prey. We